So now that we've finished up a little bit of the information processing, it's perfect time to go into memory. And so as we talk about memory, we need to understand what really we're talking about. And that's basically information that's stored later for processing. And it's a direct consequence from our ability of information processing throughout the years and how we actually process that information. When we talk about memory in the discussion, think about this. It's really based on the theoretical framework of the researcher and how they think that memory exists. But the debate is not whether or not it does exist. It's really, but rather how memory affects our daily activities and in what form memory is taken within our system, right? And really, it's a matter of forming the memory and then recalling the memory, and at which levels our process and daily activities are affected by that. And so we have two measures, right? And so the idea is we have this direct memory, and there is a purposeful search and retrieval of the past experiences. And I don't know if sometimes when I really need to think of a name or think of a title or something, I struggle a lot with that purposeful. And then when I remove myself from it a little bit later, it just stops into my head. And so that's an idea, right? And it's more of an indirect, or it's the ability to recall something without consciously processing it or thinking about it. And you hear this probably term about once you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget how to ride a bike. And so a lot of times it becomes an indirect process that just unconsciously you start to have the motor pattern going through the process. And so what we're going to talk about, the theory, is the box theories of memory. And this is going to be broken down into three components, really basically. And that's the short-term sensory store, or STSS, short-term memory, or STM, and the long-term memory, LTM. And so these are going to be what I want you to focus on when we talk about memory and understand the difference in the three components of our memory. But make sure you remember the difference between direct and indirect, and that is the idea of really consciously going after it or something happening unconsciously. So let's go first by short-term sensory store. And this is that memory that's in the peripheral. You can hold massive amounts here, in fact, the problem is that even though we can hold massive amounts, it fades and decays pretty quickly with the passage of time. And then so it's the ability to recall a number in series following the tone. And here we have, this is shows you how quickly things can go. And so letters reportedly corrects, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and immediately we can do this, and then see how rapidly you have the decay and the ability to kind of recall the number with respect to time. And so the short-term sensory store is capable of holding info for processing, but it loses information rapidly. And that's really what I want you to focus on is, yeah, you can hold lots of information, but it only is there for a short period of time. And as time goes on, there's a rapid decay or a loss of this information. So think about a literal storage of information. And literal meaning you look at the space and the form and the location, right? So it's that idea of you can literally understand where something is in space and have it go through the process. Think about this, and think about all the times you see somebody getting questioned by the cops because they have been a witness to something, and how easy it is for some things to be recalled and difficult for other things. And the really idea is it's a spatial location form that is very, very literal in storage. And that's why it's a little bit more difficult for us to remember things, and that's why things leave us rapidly, is because of that literal storage. And then you have the short-term memory, and this is the CTM, and this is delivered from the STSS or the long-term. So this is like that happy medium, and you can bring things in from the short-term sensory store, which is very literal, or you can bring things back down from the long-term memory. But it's also called the working space for processing, so this is where you're actually living. And this trigram of XBF is counting intervals or unrelated numbers, right? So XBF, if we look at that, they're not related, right? So if a related alphabet would be A, B, C, or X, Y, Z, right? So those are all kind of the literal or the related kind of alphabet, where XBF is a trigram because it's not related. Or if we did like 2, 6, 8, right? Or if we did 2, 5, 9, those are also unrelated number trigrams. And so the idea is there's information lost at about 30 to 60 seconds unless you rehearse it. And so this study right here, it talks about this idea of using the trigrams and retention intervals in seconds and how you can keep going down and down and down and down. And this study did a combination of things, and they did two. They did one where you had the ability to rehearse and one you didn't. And so when you don't do a rehearsal, they draw your attention by doing another task. So it allows you not to do it. And it's a series of the ability to recall information. So in the STM, you have a limited capacity, right? And this is one of the major differences between the STSS, but the real idea comes in with this idea of chunking. And chunking is grouping things together. And many of us also often do this when you're trying to remember, well, some of you guys, back in the day when you didn't have cell phones, we didn't have things, you didn't remember people's phone numbers, you would often chunk it, right? So instead of keeping every individual number separate, you would group them. Like if your area code was 714, it'd be 714, and you would keep that together. And then you would say, instead of 8543, you go 8543. So you're creating these chunks. And in the STM, think about this is that you have a 7-chunk capacity, right? So that is chunks of information grouping them together. And that is the capacity for which you have in this STM. Now, another major difference between the STSS and the STM is that STM is an abstract coding. This is where you start to get things more in the abstract as opposed to literal, hence a little bit more of the chunking. But that ability to get it into the abstract allows you to remember a little bit more information for a longer period of time. But it's also because its capacity is limited, right? And so if we wanted to do literal, that takes up too much information and it's too robust of information. So we want to make sure that it's a little bit more of the abstract so we can remember things. Now, this is the one where some people will refer to this and some people will bring it in, but this is really called the working memory. It's really part of that STM or the short-term memory. But there's different viewpoints that really describe this notion of working memory. But think about this. It's comprised of information from the short-term sensory store that can be stored. And then also the long-term memory info can be retrieved for processing and integrated within the short-term sensory store. So when they talk about the short-term memory, bringing that working memory, it's that ability to bring things from the short-term sensory store and the long-term memory into an active area where we're looking at it. So it's a very effortful and limited capacity, but it's that conscious processing where you're really actively thinking about and trying to remember or practice or rehearse this information. And so it's thought of as a controlled processing, but so remember this, that the higher level of activation is short-lived. So that's where these items sit. And so this working memory is this consciously in the present moment that draws things in from both of the other sensory stores. All right, then here we have the final one. And the final portion of this is that long-term memory or LTM. And this is really where following practice and rehearsal of something, and hopefully some of this information in this class becomes long-term memory for you because you have rehearsed it and actually studied it and not short-term crammed from the test. But there's a large storage capacity here. And I was actually driving my car to a conference the other day in Montana, and I started listening to some old songs that I haven't listened for a while. But because I listened to so much as a youth and through my process it became longer stories, so I was still able to recall some of the words and rhythms of it. So that is kind of this idea with a lot of practice and rehearsal, and there's a large storage capacity, so that all of a sudden sometimes it comes back without your conscious thought and you just keep going. But this provides that ability to perform movements done before with that biking and cycling that we talked about, learning how to swim and tread water if you haven't done that for a while, or playing darts. I used to play darts in pool as a kid a lot, and now I can go. I'm not as good as I used to be, but I can still go and throw a dart or play some pool and have some fun because it's stuff that I've learned along the way. And I'm not there yet with golf, right? So golf, I played a little golf, but I have not practiced or rehearsed it enough to have this permanent storage. Every time I go out and golf, I have to do some practice, and I still not very good because I have not practiced and rehearsed it enough. Going forward, we have this little table that it's going to make a lot of time for you to really pay attention to it and look at, right? And so this breaks it down. Here you have the short-term sensory store. Here you have short-term memory. Here you have the long-term memory. Know the storage duration. So the short-term sensory store is less than a second. Short-term memory 1 to 60, and then seemingly endless for the long-term memory. Typed coding, very little, more abstract to very abstract. And then the capacity, both the short-term sensory store and the long-term memory are seemingly limitless. However, the short-term memory store relies on 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information, right? And so when it talks about items, it's really talking about the chunks of information that they're utilizing to go through the process. And this is really how it works, right? And so this is the idea. You have short-term sensory store through the process of recall. It goes sometimes to working memory. And then the more that we practice and rehearse something, it can go into long-term memory. But also the long-term memory does have this ability to go back as recall into that working memory, which is a component comprised in the short-term memory. And so that's another term that people utilize for short-term memory.